Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new edition of From Washington. 7 out of 10 people in the world live in countries where inequality has increased over the last 3 decades. 85 people on the world owns more wealth than the bottom 50% of the planet. Latin America is the area, the region with the largest disparity among rich and poor. And to help us to put in perspective the subject of inequality and disparity, our guest today, Mr. Dean Baker. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me in.
You are the co-director of the CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Mr. Baker, how worrisome is this situation?
Well, it is very worrisome, but I think it's sort of more of a mixed picture. So you have a story where China, obviously the biggest country in the world, there has been a growth in inequality, but because their growth has been so rapid, much of their population has seen large increases in living standards over the last 15 years. So the International Labor Organization shows that real wages in the cities in China have tripled from 2002 to 2012. So that's a very good story. Other places, more ambiguous. You know, you mentioned Latin America, most inequality in the world. On the other hand, there's been improvements in Venezuela, in Bolivia, you know, in Brazil. So in much of Latin America, there's actually been a movement towards more equality. So you have a lot of inequality there, no doubt about it, but the movement's been in the right direction. On the other hand, the United States, pretty much all the wrong way.
What they're calling market economies, those ones are the ones who are suffering the most?
Well, I think that's also an ambiguous story. So certainly the more, you know, we like to say the United States, I'm saying we in the United States, we like to think of ourselves as a very market-oriented economy. In many ways that's true. Some way it's a little ambiguous, but certainly we've had among the largest increases in inequality. United Kingdom, which also likes to think of itself as a very market-oriented economy, large increases in inequality. A country like Germany, certainly a market economy, much less increase in inequality. So there's a mixed story there. So I don't think you can boil it down and say it's that simple that, you know, the more market-oriented economy are always the ones that have the most inequality.
There's an issue here also that is demographics. Younger countries with younger population are having like 3 billion people in the world under 25. That could be a good news and could be worrisome news for the future.
Yeah, and that again, it's one of these stories that's hard to tell. So you look at a country like China where they've had very strict controls in their population, they have a very slow growing population, and I think that's been associated with improvements in living standards for much of the population. So you're seeing rising wages, people are going to the cities and actually improving their living standards. A country like India, you know, where they have a younger population, more rapid population growth, much more mixed story. There they have, you know, less improvement in living standards and more increase in inequality. So what's going to happen? You know, you look to sub-Saharan Africa where the most rapid population growth, it's hard to say what that looks like going forward. Certainly a lot of grounds for concern.
United Nations are forecasting that by the year 2050, 50% of the world population are going to be living in cities. Is that going to have an impact in inequality disparity?
Well, it's, again, you know, it's one of these stories. It is hard to say. Historically, the movement to the cities has been associated with improvement in living standards. You know, what you'd like to see is that people move to cities because there are opportunities there. On the other hand, sometimes people move to the cities because they have no choice. You know, they lose their land, there's no work for them in the countryside, and it's out of desperation. So you hope that it's more the former than the latter. It's not going to be a simple story where you could say it's simply one, it's simply the other. It's always going to be a mix of the two.
In the case of Latin America that you were mentioning, we have seen countries that are betting on social programs, mostly progressive countries, and they definitely show an important improvement in the quality of life. The slowdown of the disparity in the case of Ecuador, for example, and Venezuela, that gap has been reduced significantly. What happened that we're not aware of this watching the media or reading the papers in the US?
Well, it's quite interesting. You know, the U.S., the accounts of the developing world is always very skewed. So it's quite striking, you know, when they want to hold up a country as a model in the developing world, very often it's Mexico, which has had among the worst both overall growth in Latin America in the last, say, 2 decades, and also the worst in terms of progress on reducing inequality, reducing poverty. But they did what the U.S. told them to. You know, we had NAFTA back in 1993. They followed our model, and it's really worked out very poorly for them. The countries that have gone the opposite direction, Venezuela, Ecuador, you can throw in Bolivia, you can throw in Argentina, all of those were not following the playbook from Washington, and they've had much better results in terms of living standards for most of their population.
And the newspapers or the media, the mass media, do not reflect that part of the equation as they do with Mexico or the friendly countries like Colombia.
No, that's exactly right, and it's really been quite striking how they've been willing to really just skew reality. You know, so Argentina in the 1990s, they were following a neoliberal model, and they were a poster child. They were held up, you know, they're doing everything right. Well, of course, they got into very big trouble. They had a debt crisis. This is all following the neoliberal model. Then, you know, they were forced into a default, and then they went on a different path. And for the longest time, they kept saying, you know, you could read what they were saying about the Argentina newspapers, 2003, 4, 5, that, oh, its economy is about to collapse. And instead, it kept growing and was growing quite rapidly. And there were finally gains for most of the population, not just a small share. Reading the newspapers, for the most part, you would not see that.
Talking about the free trade agreement, for example, what was called NAFTA in the North America region, we have seen that between the year 1995, the beginning of the NAFTA free trade agreement, to 2005, 10 years, the U.S. were putting $55 billion in subsidies, selling agricultural products to Mexico, dropping or leaving 2.3 million agricultural workers in Mexico jobless. We see an incredible amount of undocumented people coming to the U.S. Is this a way to provoke modern slavery?
Well, I mean, it's not a desirable situation. I mean, I'm a little reluctant to say that this was like deliberate in the sense that anyone planned for the impoverishment. I think it was very poorly thought out. The idea, you know, if you want to say insofar what was the development strategy, the idea, the hope, whatever you want to say, was you had enough growth in manufacturing to absorb the displacement in agriculture. I mean, it wasn't a surprise. You know, everyone knew that Mexico had a very inefficient agricultural sector. You opened them up to trade with the U.S., they were going to have millions of people displaced from agriculture. That was known. I mean, people talked about this back in 92, 93, 94 when NAFTA was being debated. So that wasn't a surprise. The question was, would they have job opportunities in the manufacturing sector? And the answer is no. You know, certainly there was some expansion in manufacturing, but not enough to absorb 2 to 3 million people displaced in agriculture.
So basically also what we see like the illegal or undocumented immigration has to do with the structure of an economic system that not necessarily is helping the more vulnerable people.
Well, no one in their right mind would go through what people do to come up here as undocumented workers. You know, it's a very harrowing journey to get across the border. Many people actually die in the process. Once they come here, if they're undocumented, they have to work at the lowest paying jobs. They know that, you know, they could go through a traffic light and be picked up for that and then end up being deported. You wouldn't do that if you had a decent paying job. So the reason they come here is really out of desperation.
So it's not necessarily in search of freedom and liberty?
Well, I'll tell you actually, because of the violence in Mexico and in places in Central America, in some cases, I don't know if you want to say freedom and liberty, but it is to escape violence in some cases.
Well, that has to do with also in many senses with drug trafficking, and that's another issue where, to put it very bluntly, like about 5% of the world population, that the U.S. consumes about 50% of the cocaine of the world. And that angle of the drug problem, we don't see it. The official line is this is a problem with shared responsibilities, and a very reluctant writer, Eduardo Galeano in Uruguay, says, yes, it's a shared responsibility. We put the dead people, you guys put the noses.
Yeah, well, this whole issue wouldn't be there if you didn't have the mark in the United States. So
and the violence, probably.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, people fight because there's a lot of money. If there were no money there, there'd be nothing to fight over.
And there's no consumption. If there were not consumption,
there wouldn't be money there.
Mr. Becker, I will invite you to have a seat and discuss what's going on with inequality in the U.S.
Okay.
Mr. Becker, I want to show you what Senator Bernie Sanders said precisely in the Congress behind you about inequality.
Today, the wealthiest 400 individuals in America own more wealth than the bottom half of America, 150 million people, 400 and 150 million. Today, and this is really quite amazing, the 6 heirs to the Walmart fortune, the Walmart company, of course, started by Sam Walton, his children, one family, now own more wealth than do the bottom 30% of the American people. One family owns more wealth than the bottom 30%, 90 million Americans. And I know we have some of my colleagues coming up here and say, look, not everybody in America is paying taxes. You got millions of people who are not paying any taxes. No kidding. They don't have any money because all of the money is on the top.
So, what do you think?
Well, it is striking. I guess I'd say a couple of things. First off, it isn't new. I mean, it's somewhat worse today than it would have been 30 years ago, but you always had huge disparities in wealth because the reality has been, even, the United States likes to say, middle-class country, everyone has some wealth. The reality was that, you take the bottom 30% or so of the population, they never had any wealth. So that's not qualitatively new. Now, you take the very richest people, he's focusing on the Waltons here that are the main owners of Walmart or principal shareholders. They have gotten wealthier relative to everyone else, no doubt about that. So definitely his point is accurate. The other point I'd say goes a little bit the other way. I will say we have a better social safety net today than we did, say, 30 or 40 years ago. So here I'm thinking of things like our Social Security program, earned income tax credit for low-income workers. It doesn't negate what he's saying at all. But if you look at income, so if you say someone who's, at the bottom 10th, bottom 20% of income, they're probably somewhat better off today than they were 30 or 40 years ago because of these government programs.
And the trend continues?
Yes, I mean, and that's what's really disconcerting. So it's one thing we could look back over the last 3 decades and say there's a huge increase in inequality. Not that I'm going to say it's okay, but you go, okay, so what does it look like we go 10, 20, 30 years out? What I worry very much is that's just going to keep continuing.
1 in 6 Americans need food assistance. They do it through, if you want, private food banks. 1 in 7 Americans get food stamps. We're talking 50 million people out of 310 million. Is this the land of opportunity?
Well, this is a horrible situation. I mean, some of this is due to the recession, which you could say, okay, we'll recover. On the other hand, the recession was 7 years ago. So you go, okay, when are we going to recover? And, realistically, I mean, things are getting somewhat better, but it's not as though I'm going to say next year it's going to be hugely different. It'll be a little better. I hope at least it'll be a little better. That's not a very good story. And, even people who have jobs, if you're working at a minimum wage job, $7.25 an hour, that gets you less than $15,000 a year. You can't support, say you have 2 kids, 1 worker, 2 kids, $15,000 a year. There's no way on earth you could have, I just mean a minimal standard of living, a roof over your head, food for your kids, clothing. You cannot do that, $15,000 a year.
The richest 1% captured 95% of all income gains since 2009, while the bottom 90% got poorer. How the 90% is not reacting?
Well, I think, people often are in a situation where they say two things. One, it could be worse. So you could always look at the person who's doing worse than you. So, people have a job and they're not seeing any wage gains. Well, it's better than not having a job. And the other thing is it's not clear because they don't hear alternatives. So, they look to our politicians, we could look to the Democrats who tend to be, more supportive of workers than the Republicans, but still, what are they saying? What are they throwing out there that will actually improve people's living standards? And it's not as though, I'll generally like the Democrats more than the Republicans too, but it's not as though I could tell you, okay, here, if we had the Democrats controlling Congress, here's what they would do. Here's what President Obama wants to do for you. So they don't see a lot of alternatives out there.
Robert Reich and former Secretary of Labor say none of this has happened, that situation, by accident. He said we allowed it to happen, and they say that is a result of policy decisions, and he mentioned taxes, education, trade, labor, macroeconomics, financial regulations. Is something different that we can expect in the coming future?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, one certainly hopes. I mean, some of the things are likely to be different whether it's anyone's choice or not. For example, right now the United States has a very big trade deficit. Much of that's with China, not exclusively. that may not continue. That's been brought about because of policies on the other side. China has had this export promotion policy. Who are they exporting to a very large extent, the United States. That might change because they want to develop their internal economy. If they end their trade deficit, that means more jobs for people in the United States. So it's independent of what anyone here in Washington's decided. That will change. So that will be a positive. You know, some of the other things, you know, will we see factors that will affect, you know, CEO pay? CEO pay has just gone through the roof. A typical CEO is paid 300 or 400 times an average worker.
Talking about $11 million as an average salary.
I mean, and this is, you know, people talk about superstar CEOs. There's some CEOs, sure, they turn around their companies. Most of them aren't superstars. Some of them run their companies in the ground. So will that change? You know, again, one hopes, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say for sure what will change it. You know, one of the things that's been a big factor that Robert Reich talks about a lot, weakening of labor unions. You know, so are we going to see a larger share of our workforce unionized? Just 5%, 6% of our private sector workers are now in unions. It was 20% just 3 decades ago. Is that going to turn around? Well, it's going to be difficult. There's some things you could point to, but can I say it's going to turn around? Hard to say.
What effect all this situation is having in democracy?
Well, it's very hard to see how you have a democracy in a situation where some people have huge amounts of money and they're willing to use it to support candidates. And it's very clear. I mean, everyone, I mean, this isn't like, you know, sort of a fringe view. Everyone understands if you want to run for office, you need lots of money. So I don't just mean the president. Of course, the president needs lots of money. But if you want a seat in Congress, we have 435 members of the House of Representatives. You have to raise millions of dollars. We're not going to go to people that are earning $20,000 a year, $30,000 a year and get, you know, maybe they, yeah, I'm running for office, they really like me. Maybe they can give me $10. I'm not going to get, you know, the $2 or $3 or $4 million just to be competitive. You have to go to rich people. So what that means is that anyone who's running for office has to get at least a substantial amount of money from rich people because those are the only people who have it. And that means, you know, they basically have a veto. So you're not going to get someone elected who doesn't at least have some segment of rich people behind them.
And if the first 3 words of the Constitution of the U.S. is "we the people," and 99% of the people got poorer in the last 5 years, are we the people represented in the government in the interests of the majority?
Well, it's, you know, obviously they have some representation. You know, you go back to 2012, we had an election between Mitt Romney, who I think was fairly openly identified with the very rich. You know, President Obama did make some measures to, you know, propose some things that did appeal to the larger segments of the population there, and there have been some improvements. I mean, Affordable Care Act that President Obama passed extends health care coverage. So there are some things you could point to. Is this any sort of ideal democracy? No, nothing close.
President Obama, in the State of the Union address 2014 regarding the divide between the rich and poor.
Today, after 4 years of economic growth, corporate profits and stock prices have rarely been higher, and those at the top have never done better. But average wages have barely budged. Inequality has deepened. Upward mobility has stalled. The cold hard fact is that even in the midst of recovery, too many Americans are working more than ever just to get by, let alone to get ahead.
That is the description of the situation. So what is the government as a whole? I'm not talking about the president, I'm talking about the Congress, as a whole trying to defend the people, the less fortunate.
Well, there are, you know, again, there are some things. I'm not going to say it's zero. So, you know, President Obama's proposed raising the minimum wage to $10.10. That's about a 30% increase. So that's a substantial increase in the minimum wage. A lot of that's actually happening at the state and local level. So you have a lot of states in the country that have actually raised their minimum wage, you know, in many cases $1, $2 an hour above the federal minimum wage. Seattle, just the city of Seattle, raised its minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now that's over a 7-year period, so that won't happen tomorrow. So you could point to things like that. So it's not that there's zero, but, you know, it's not nearly enough to counteract all of the things going in the opposite direction, taking money away from working people.
Even the President Obama is pointing the issue of disparity or inequality of one of the biggest issues in the life of the country.
Absolutely. And, you know, again, it's, you know, I'll give him some credit. He is pushing for a higher minimum wage. You know, I was mentioning earlier the Affordable Care Act, which, you know, is enormously important to people because now you have a lot of moderate income people that could afford health insurance, could not previously. You had a lot of people, most people had health insurance, had it through their job, and that what that meant was they were terrified to lose their job. So even if they had a job they hated, their boss was a jerk, they had to go to that job. Now those people have an option, they can still get health insurance. So there are some positive things I would point to. But again, on the scheme of things, they're still losing.
And that, if you want, approach of the market economy is being exported to some other parts of the world, for example, Latin America, and therefore pushing for creating inequality?
Well, certainly the model that the U.S. has supported, and again, I'd say there's different market economies. So we could point to, Germany has a very different market economy that hasn't seen the same sort of growth and inequality. So there have been other examples of market economies that haven't gone the same route towards inequality as the U.S., but certainly the model that, was developed in the United States, referred to as the Washington Consensus neoliberal model, that, to my view, has been very much associated with inequality, and the countries that have followed that, I think, have really suffered, or at least most of their population has suffered because of it.
And we see that in Latin America, for example, in the case of Chile, doing extremely well or better than other countries in the region, where inequality is at the highest level in Latin America. Brazil, Chile, even Colombia, Panama.
It's a mixed story, because I would say Chile's made some progress in recent years. Again, moving away from that model.
Right.
Certainly you go back to 1980, when it was, more in its full form, you had enormous inequality and, enormous suffering for the working population. But I think, in more recent years, as they moved away from that model, I think, their workers have seen some gains.
What do you think the role of the media in this area of maintaining the model or maintaining the information about inequality?
Well, the media has gotten better in the United States in terms of its coverage of the United States. Its coverage, I would say, of much of the world has been pretty bad. And taking the case of Argentina, again, it's one I'm somewhat familiar with. The coverage there, when they were following the neoliberal model in the 90s, it was glorifying it. When they moved away from that in the last decade, it was treated as a pariah, as, just doing crazy
demonizing
things. Demonizing, exactly. And even though there were very substantial gains for the population, and taking the opposite case, Mexico, which, did follow the neoliberal model very closely, praise to the sky. We used to joke about it. Every 6 months or so, they'd talk about Mexico's booming middle class. And we're going, what are you talking about? It's not in the data. It's just a figment of their imagination.
So not necessarily what we are watching or hearing reflect exactly a clear picture or a precise picture of what's going on.
That's right. It was very much oriented, if you did what, followed the neoliberal model, the reporting was you were doing good things, things were working out well. If you didn't follow it, they would say that things were working out poorly. And of course, it's not to say that the opposite was always true, because, countries did the other things and sometimes they didn't turn out well, and there are some positive things you could show for the neoliberal model, but you weren't getting an honest picture.
We have seen in the passing days another summit of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, announcing that they're going to create a development bank. Any impact in this situation of inequality, of disparity around the world?
I think there's enormous potential there, because, before countries had to turn to the International Monetary Fund when they got in trouble, and usually...
That is not that far from here.
Not that far from here, that's right. And, usually it meant going into a straitjacket. Now, I will, to give credit to their top leadership, they have tried to move away from that. Now, that doesn't mean in every country, and I've talked with people there. So you have, on the one hand, the top leadership saying, no, we don't want to follow that, but you go to the people who are actually giving advice to specific countries. They're doing the exact same thing they always did. So whether that will change or not, who knows? But having an alternative source, so when you have a country that needs financing, needs development aid, if they have an alternative source that doesn't come with this straitjacket model, I think it could have a huge impact.
Is that an economic decision, or has to do also with a political decision?
Well, I think it's clearly both. I mean, if you're sitting there from the standpoint of the BRICS and you're in a position, certainly China, less or so the other countries, you're in a position to be lending money to support development. On the one hand, if countries actually prosper, they're going to be your political allies. But the other thing is, and this is something people like to say in the United States, and we do have a model here that, when countries grow, they're better trading partners. Our model is Europe. The U.S. actually did this, the Marshall Plan after World War II. We had a very generous plan to help reconstruct Europe after World War II, and it's hugely successful. So you look at France, you look at Germany, these are rich countries today, in part because we supported a plan to redevelop Europe that really did allow them to prosper.
Finally, Mr. Baker, the idea of BRICS creating the new bank, they represent close to 50% of the world population and 20% of the trade in the world. That means that the balance of power in the world is swinging is changing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was happening in any case. But, you know, it's clear the United States, you know, people in the United States, it's going to take them a while to catch on because they're used to having this idea we do whatever we want and people live with it. Well, China's already got a larger economy than the U.S., and you carry that out 10 years, they're going to be about 50% larger. And then if they're acting in conjunction with Brazil, with Russia, with India and South Africa, you're talking about a hugely larger block of countries. So the U.S. is not going to be the power in the world, which isn't to say they're not going to be important, but we're not going to be able to act unilaterally and just tell everyone else, take it or leave it. Those days are over.
Mr. Dean Baker, thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.